Okay, so I can slowly start. My name is João. I'm a PhD student at Nova in Lisbon, and this is joint work with José Tavares and Pedro Vicente, who are also at Nova. So, and our paper is called "Can ATMs Get Out the Vote? Evidence from a Nationwide Field Experiment." So, we know that for democracies, the problem of low turnout is more and more important as elections evolve. So it's very important not only for theoretical, but also for practical reasons to study what makes one decide to vote. So in this paper, we report on a large scale that we randomized and designed to study an unexploited mode of communication for get out the vote, which are ATMs, automatic teller machines. So these machines that you can use to withdraw money and more. So our design allows to follow a get out the vote message, and our message tries to elicit voters by considering their civil duty. I'm going to show the messages we broadcasted in just a minute. So the ATM campaign was active for 3 days, and these were the days before and the day of the 2017 local election in Portugal that happened for all local jurisdictions. We also ran a post-treatment survey around few ATMs in 2 civil parishes, one in the treatment and one in the control group. And this was just 1 week after local elections, and the goal was to assess differences in recall of the message. So very briefly, so in a nutshell, we find that we find a small but statistically significant decrease in the likelihood of voting, but this happens when we consider the intensity of treatment measured by the number of cards that were used in an ATM, and this was vis-a-vis the control group. So this was basically our treatment. It says it's in Portuguese. It says to vote is a duty. Today vote, and since it happened in the last 3 days of the election, it could mean, so the only differences were this Sunday vote, tomorrow vote, or today vote. And for you to have an idea about our campaigning numbers, so this happened so messages were active in 3 different periods. So they were rolling in the background before you approach the ATM. But then when you approach, you insert your card, and before you are able to include your PIN number, we would see, if you were in the treatment group, you would see our message for about 4 seconds. Then you introduce your PIN number, and you would see our message for 4 more seconds. And then you are able to withdraw money or do other operations, and I'll talk about that. So for you to have an idea, this covered 1/6 of the civil parishes, which is the lower level of local administrations in Portugal. It was so 682, and you can see them in the map for continental Portugal. So this is the number of ATM machines, and the number of cards were more than 1.5 million. And for you to have an idea, there are about a little bit more than 9 million voters in Portugal. So let me take one step back very quickly. So to ask why would a rational individual vote? So if a rational individual would compare costs and benefits of voting, and he would see that he is pivotal the probability of being pivotal is very, very low in these elections. And then considering the sure costs of going to vote with the potential benefits of being pivotal, a rational individual would not vote. But we see high levels of turnout in the world. So there has to be something else that is not poorly explained by our by the Homo economics way of thinking. So randomized experiments are good candidates to address problems caused by self-selection, strategic targeting, or unobserved confounders. So previous research has pointed out that one-way methods are less effective at mobilizing turnout, but there are some exceptions. And and one way modes of get out the vote. So the traditional ones are mail or canvassing, but we are exploiting something that is a low cost, very low cost. So for you to have an idea, the cost of just one addition of targeting one additional voter was below 3 cents of an euro. So it's really a low cost, and I give you a few examples here that there are papers studying the impact of radio, newspaper, street sign, and TV. So this is what we are doing is a completely different and new mode of communication. So just a few words about the ATM company. So the ATM network is a very credible communication channel. They are basically the monopolists for all the country. So the only competitor they have had less than 300 terminals, and this was concentrated. These was target tourists, which is an important industry in Portugal. So so the ATM is very reliable, and it's one of the largest interbank networks in Europe. And besides money withdrawing, the network has the largest number of functionalities worldwide. So you can do a lot of things, including mobile top-ups, transport tickets, paying for issuing or fishing licenses. You can pay for your taxes in the ATM. So you can do many more than just withdrawing money. It's a very well done system. So data, our unit of observation are civil parishes, the lowest local administrative unit in the country. Portuguese local elections are exogenously fixed every 4 years. So this was happening at the same time for everyone. And the outcomes is the official turnout. Our outcome of interest is official turnout. Then we are able to combine this data with treatment assignment and descriptive information that is provided by the ATM company. And we have measures of intensity. So the number of cards that were used in each civil parish, the number of operations, and the number of withdrawals. So withdrawal of money is just one of these possible operations. So we do not include foreign cards, from tourists, and we also account for potential confounding factors using detailed socioeconomic and political information. So what we did to sample and in terms of sample and randomization, so we focus our attention in all the civil parishes that have at least one ATM, and this cover more than 90% of the population. So only very rural and very distant areas do not have at least one ATM. So the randomization procedure, so we form blocks of civil parishes within each municipality, which is the level above, and then we condition on few observables. And we perform several balance tests using other variables, and you have here the list of the huge list showing that it is indeed balanced ourselves. So estimation strategies, our outcome is the turnout rate in 2017 for civil parish I in municipality J. We have municipality fixed effects, and then our coefficient of interest is beta 1 or beta 2. So in the intention to treat effects estimation is beta 1, which is comparing civil parishes that were treated with control. And in the intensity of treatment, we are interacting this dummy variable with measures of intensity. And these measures of intensity are the measures that I just talked about. And let me show you. So one possible concern would be spillovers, but we want to point out that if there are spillovers, our estimates are a lower bound, so we know the direction of this possible bias. So if an individual works in a treated area but votes in a control area, so there's downward bias, and the same happens if an individual would work in a control area, but then we would vote in a treated area. So therefore, the results are lower bounds estimates of the true impact if these spillovers happen. So in terms of the intention to treat effects, we do not find we do not have statistically significant results, but we see that as we are introducing dummies, the coefficient of the point estimate is more or less constant, but the standard errors decrease substantially. So these points that we do not have power to detect these, even though we are using all the possible ATMs in the country. However, when we consider differently civil parishes that do see a lot our treatment measured by these intensity measures, we see that we find a statistically significant impact. If we measure treatment versus the number of cards versus the number of operations or times the number of withdrawals. And all of them are statistically significant and point to a small impact, but it's there. So one possible concern related to what I said would be about spillovers. So instead of just considering the impact in Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, if we just focus our impact on Saturday and on the weekend, we would see that we have basically the same results. Then we did a series of robustness checks. So we had an horse race with other possible mechanisms to see if these were if there were omitted variable bias driving possible omitted variable bias driving our results. So we had intensity times treatment, but we also had a horse race with intensity times measures of education or intensity times demographic composition of the civil parish, and it is the intensity times the treatment dummy that seems to be affecting our results, having an impact on our results, and the others are not statistically significant. We also removed Lisbon and Oporto municipalities or the bigger metropolitan areas to see that this is not being driven by the most urban and more populated areas. So we also removed, for another test, we also removed the autonomous regions of Azores and Madeira, and we include more controls, and still or we remove commercial areas, so civil parishes that have a lot of ATMs because there is a shopping center or a big shopping center there. We remove these, so in these areas people do not typically live, but there are not a lot of them. But if we remove from our sample, the point estimate is basically unchallenged. One important falsification result that I would like to talk to you about is, instead of using the turnout for the local elections in 2017, if we use the turnout, if we do some placebo tests with the turnout for the EU elections in 2014 or for the legislative elections in 2015, so the two elections that happened before, we basically have a bunch of zeros. So nothing is significant in this case. Okay, so let me just, if I have some time, let me just talk about very quickly about a post-treatment recall survey that we implemented. So 1 week, so Sunday morning, 1 week after the local elections, we went to 2 civil parishes, to 4 ATMs in each each civil parish, and we let people use their ATMs. So this is one in the treatment and one in control, and these are areas where spillovers are. So these are neighboring civil parishes. They are very close. There are a lot of people commuting and working in these 2 areas. The scale is very small here, and we after people use the ATMs, there was a student asking them, well, I'm sorry for interrupting, can I ask a question? So can you please tell me if you recall seeing the message that of our treatment, so our campaign image. And there was a difference between treatment and control, and it's about 10% more. And so people recall seeing that, only 20% recall seeing, but 10% more recall seeing that in the treated area vis-a-vis in the control area. So even in these in these very close areas, neighboring civil parishes, the results are still there. Well, what about the costs? So I said that we had like 2% of so reaching an additional voter was below 3%, and in terms of if the ATE would be statistically significant, we would estimate an impact about $20 to get one additional voter, which compared to what we see in canvassing, which is much more expensive, canvassing, email, and mail, it would be lower than these cases. So let me quickly conclude by saying that the main contribution of this paper is to conduct a field experiment using something that to the best of our knowledge, was unexploited so far, a mode of communication. So to mobilize voters to get out the vote, which are ATMs. And we try to reach potential voters with a message based on duty considerations. So you should vote because it's your duty. The campaign spanned all Portuguese regions, from the capital to rural and insular regions, and was run for the 3 days before the election. So results considering the intensity of treatment for both the entire campaign period and at the weekend show a statistically significant 0.1 to 0.6 percentage point increase in the likelihood of voting, and we believe that the experiment and the data collected are unique in scope. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to hear your questions.
Thanks, Joel. It's a very interesting talk, and you are very much in time. You actually have finished 3 minutes earlier, so we have 8 minutes for questions or the discussions. Do anyone have a question? If you have
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Please.
When you look at your intensity results, right? So to look at the total effect, you have to both look at the interaction effect and the baseline treatment effect, and then it seems that for low intensity, you actually have a negative effect.
It depends on the number of cards, right?
Right. So for a low number of cards, you have a negative effect.
Exactly. Yes, but then when we have for the number of cards, when for high numbers, so that's typically it's not the case that these municipalities, these ATMs in rural areas are not used. That is not the case. There's still some use of ATMs measured by these intensity measures. But of course, in more populated areas, this number goes well, very much, goes up very much.
I guess it's an artifact of linearity assumption, right? That you get this negative intercept, assuming that this is a linear relationship.
Yes, we also tried by dividing the areas in quartiles or something like this to go beyond this linearity assumption, and we see the effect on the very last quartile only.
Yeah, and that precisely generates then this, that if you throw this into a linear one, you estimate a negative intercept for a hypothetical ATM that's not used, which probably doesn't exist in your data set.
Some of them are not super used, but it's really a small fraction.
I have a question. So thank you very much. Really, really cool research project. I'm a little bit curious about how you managed to get your messages into the ATMs in the first place. But my question is, do you have a sense of whether the types of people using ATM machines differs much from the general population? And if so, what implication might that have for your results? So I'm just thinking about in the UK, I have the sense that maybe fewer younger people use ATM machines because they just do everything using contactless payment cards. And so then that might, and maybe younger people are harder to convince to get out to vote. So, but yeah, we'd be curious to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
So our survey is not, it's not huge, but we have people from using ATMs from 18 years old to 91. So it's something that was very surprising for me. So so looking at the reports of the ATM company, they showed, and so they conducted some surveys and so on, and they show that it's very appealing because you are able to do a lot of things in the ATM. So it's not just withdrawing money. And these are very much used. So it's really something that we are used to for a long time. So in the paper, I have some graphs showing that even during the crisis and so on, the number of people using ATMs and the number of operations and so on are increasing, even in recent periods. But is of course something that it's very important. I would like to say more about exactly who are using the ATMs. I know that on average, and this is a rough measure because I do not know exactly where the people live, where they are using the ATMs, but on average, I see that in this period, in the treatment group, about 80% of the population were using these ATMs in this week before. In these 3 days before, sorry, but it's there could be many people from other municipalities, and I'm not counting the same people twice. I don't have that information. So if I use the ATMs in 2 civil parishes, I'm counted twice, and I'm not able to follow the card owner, but it's still very much. It's still a lot.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Some words about how we managed to so we wanted to do a get out the vote experiment, but we basically had no money, and we tried to convince supermarkets to have in the receipt something say go and vote after you pay, but then it was basically my father-in-law who is a policeman saying, well, what you could do is use ATMs, they are everywhere. And I remember that at Nova, my university, there's a professor which happens to be this, there was a professor, he's no longer there, but that happened to be the CEO of the ATM company. So we managed to talk with him, and it was very difficult because 2 or 3 days before the local elections, this was still not approved. So there was a huge uncertainty, but we managed to do it basically for free. And it was
great. I think it was a great treatment because I think you have a much better chance of having high attention on an ATM machine versus, you know, a receipt or so.
Just a few seconds, but you are waiting to introduce your PIN number. So it's something that it's important, and you are waiting to withdraw money. So you have to pay attention.
Yeah, for sure. Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Is there room for one more question?
I have a question basically about the mechanism of your results and the possible heterogeneous treatment effect. One story in my mind about to interpret your result is, could it be that the ATM notification just remind people about there's an upcoming election, for otherwise they don't follow politics, they don't even know it. And so could it be that you push people to turn out only simply because you reminded them of an existence of an election in 3 days? And if this is the case, I was wondering if your treatment is only effective for those people who do not follow politics, know there is existing election, compared to others who already know there is an election. So I don't know if you can speak something about this.
It could certainly be that. We are not able to distinguish if it's a reminder or what is really driving the effect. If it's a reminder, I would say that it's very difficult to, it could be a reminder, but it would be very difficult not to know that there would be an election coming, because there are outdoors everywhere, and in the TV, the campaigns are there are, for a month we do not talk about anything else. But a reminder could certainly be if I have not yet planned, or in the day of the election, it could certainly be. It's difficult. I could speculate a little, but it's difficult to.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, thanks for this clarification. Yeah, I think now the time is up, and we should move to the.
Thank you so much.
Speaker, Dirk.
You have to unshare.
Yeah, Dirk, you can share.
Mine. Where is it? Here. Okay. Oh, okay. One more button, and should go for full screen now. That's all.
Yeah.
Okay. You see it? Okay. So this is about experiment on tax choices, taxing particular high-income people. This is a survey experiment. If I have a minute in the end, I'll tell you why the lab experiment on this issue, or specifically our lab experiment that we ran earlier, was useless. So this is a good case for doing surveys, or including experiments and surveys. This is joint work with a number of people who were in Mannheim at some stage. So the motivation is very simple. I can keep that short. If rich people are mobile, then you can't tax them as highly, right? And so that puts pressure on governments to lower taxes, because if the rich run away, we can't, we want to tax them maybe a bit less. And so there are arguments that globalization in general, in particular, but also with respect to mobility, leads to a race to the bottom and inefficiently low taxes and public spending. And so you have these famous cases when the French introduced a rich tax, that Gérard Depardieu became a Russian citizen and stuff like this. Now, in an experimental conference, I probably don't have to explain that while this textbook argument is logically fine, people may not always choose like that. And they may not do that for two reasons, because they may not be perfectly rational. We know a bit about non-rational tax choices, for example, from the experiments by Sausgruber and Turon, who have shown that people tend to overtax themselves because they don't expect liability side equivalence, but also by actually the same plus another co-author, that social preferences also matter. And because the rich people may actually be willing to pay more taxes than they have to, and the poor may actually want to exploit the rich even more than would be rational. So the first question we ask is essentially, do the rich actually migrate whenever it pays? And do the poor, or what you can call the net beneficiaries of the tax transfer system, anticipate this mobility and hence vote for lower taxes? Now, if we argue that social preferences may matter and also beliefs matter, these are likely to be heterogeneous. And it's likely that this heterogeneity correlates with political attitudes. So there are a number of other experiments that show that political attitudes matter for redistribution choices. So for example, Almos and others have shown that Norwegians distribute more than Americans, in particular when inequality is due to luck. And you may argue that Norwegians and Americans may have different political attitudes. Karaja, Möllerstrom, Sain, they have an experiment where they show that if you inform people about their ranking in the income distribution, and hence whether they benefit from redistribution or net payers, if you tell them that they're actually higher up, so they're more likely to be net payers, people become more right-wing and more opposed towards redistribution, but only if they are already right of center. So you push the people from the moderate right to the further right, which is in Sweden, so it's not that right actually, but from less moderate to, from more moderate to less moderate. And one of us, Eckhard Jannemann, he had a classroom experiment actually with students and has shown that the political preference, party preference, relates to tax choices. And he also has a survey with politicians. And in that case, it's not tax choices, but their beliefs about the migration of rich people or rich companies. Okay. Hence, we have a second set of questions, which is more the interesting one, about the relationship between tax and migration choice and political attitudes. So one question is, do the beliefs differ? So do, as in Eckhardt's survey, the left-leaning expect maybe less migration of rich people than the right-leaning? Second, even if the beliefs don't differ, do still the tax choices of the poor people differ? Maybe because the left-wing are more spiteful. And finally, do the rich choose different tax, and do they migrate actually less if they are more left than right? And we do that in a survey experiment in a representative household panel because we need a lot of people who support interesting parties, and that's what we can't get in the lab. I may get back to that in the end. So because it's in a survey, in an online survey, it has to be super simple. So our text game is as simple as we could make it while still keeping it interesting. So we have people matched into countries of 3 people, 2 poor, 1 rich. And the poor earns 20, the rich earns 90. And then there is a purely redistributive tax. So the rich can pay, the rich has to pay a tax, and it's split between the two poor, and there are 3 admissible tax levels, 10, 20, and 40. And hence net income you can calculate. One important thing is the rich still stays richer than the poor, even if you pay the maximum tax rate. Okay, so then we have 2 cases. We have a closed economy without migration and an open economy with migration. So without mobility, we have a simple, the only task is to choose the taxes, and to have a simple incentive compatible mechanism, we use a random dictator mechanism. So everybody is actually stating a preferred tax rate, low, medium, or high, and then one of them is picked randomly and is implemented. Now we assume that people have social preferences, and because this is about redistribution and no reciprocity involved, it's fine to assume standard Fair-Schmidt inequality aversion. And I don't give you the standard formula. You can just see that one thing is very easy. For the poor, the tax rate enters positively independently of the inequality aversion. The alpha is the parameter of aversion towards other people being richer. And of course, the more you dislike others being richer, the more you like high taxes, but you like high taxes anyway because you get more money. For the rich, it's more interesting. You see that at the very end, at the bottom here, if beta, that's the aversion towards being richer than others, is larger than 2/3, you actually prefer higher taxes. So the inequality versus rich people like high taxes. Okay. Now in the open economy, you can move to an exogenous foreign country if you don't like your taxes at home, but it has moving costs. Could be monetary or social or whatever, 15. As you note, we had 3 tax levels, 10, 20, and 40. 15 is larger than the difference between 10 and 20, but it's smaller than the difference between 20 and 40. So it pays monetarily to migrate if the taxes at home are high and abroad they're not. And so the foreign tax is exogenous and known. And so your net income, if you migrate, is 90, if you're rich, minus foreign tax minus 50. And then you can calculate that the rich will migrate if the migration costs are not too high, and the right-hand side is actually increasing in beta, no, decreasing in beta. So that means the more inequality averse you are, the nicer you are as a rich person, the less likely you are to migrate. And so for the poor, what matters in the migration setting is their expectation of the inequality aversion of the rich, because if you think the rich are nice, you can vote for high taxes because they're not going to run away. And potentially your own inequality aversion matters, but only if you're super inequality averse. If you really hate the rich to be richer, you're willing to burn a lot of money to send them away to a foreign country and suffer. So that's not, it's okay. So we implement that in a survey, and this is on the German internet panel, which is run in Mannheim. We had about 3,000 participants. The nice thing here compared to experiments with students is we have 15% of people who are older than 65, 10% earn more than 5,000 euros, and half of them are not students. They wouldn't be allowed to study at the university because they don't have the sufficient high school degree. And we keep it very simple. People get their tailor-made instructions for treatment because we wanted potentially high incentives, but did want to spend millions. We randomly drew 20 countries, hence 60 participants who really got paid in euros. So these 90 actually turn out to be 90 euros. So it's, and also paying tax of 40 meant 40 euros less, but only with a small probability. So on average, the people who were paid 41.3 euros. And then we send about a quarter of the people to the immobile treatment because that's only the tax choice, not the mobility choice, 3/4 to mobility. And foreign tax high is also not so exciting because then you don't want a mobile. So we have fewer people less. Okay, this is just an illustration in German. this is how we illustrated the choice to the people. So with nice figures that made it easy, and we had the impression people understood things. So the experimental tasks then are for all people to pick a tax level, which may then be picked with probability 1/3, and to also guess which tax level the other type votes for. So the rich guess what the poor vote for, the poor what the rich vote for. And in the open economy treatment, the rich were also asked whether they want to migrate with a strategy method that is conditioning on the home taxes, because we match them only ex post. So for every possible home tax, we ask them whether they want to migrate. And the poor are also asked whether they think the rich migrates for every possible choice. And one nice thing, except for having more variety of people, is, well, doing the survey, is we have all kinds of other data. We have from earlier ways political party preference, and even a question about preference for government redistribution, and all kinds of controls you want. So our hypotheses are based partly on simple comparative statics of the model. That is, if it pays to migrate, you're more likely to migrate, but also on the assumption that the left-leaning people are more inequality averse than right-leaning ones. So first hypothesis, for example, is the left-leaning rich vote for higher taxes than the right-leaning rich. Second hypothesis, 3 parts. First, simple comparative statics. The rich migrate more if it pays materially than if it doesn't. Second, the left-leaning rich migrate less than the right-leaning rich when it pays. So when it pays, your inequality aversion matters. When it doesn't pay, it's likely an error, and that shouldn't matter with political attitudes. So that's the third one. The third hypothesis then is about the beliefs of the poor with regarding the migration choice. So we expect that the poor understand the logic. So they expect the rich to be more likely to migrate if it pays than if it does not. And we also expect, or at least it's possible, and based on the survey we had seen earlier, the left-leaning might be more optimistic that the rich will not leave than the right-leaning. And then that results in a fourth hypothesis regarding the tax choices of the poor. So first of all, that the poor take the migration choice of the rich into account on the migration possibilities. So they're more likely to vote for lower taxes if migration pays. They're also less likely to vote for high taxes if they state that they believe they will migrate. So they're not only reacting to the logic of the model, but to their stated beliefs. And then if 4-2 and 3-2 are correct, what we get is 4-3, that the left-leaning poor vote for higher taxes than the right-leaning poor. So what do we see? Hypothesis 1, we see significant support, highly significant support. The left-leaning rich vote for higher taxes than the right-leaning rich. So this is here essentially a marginal effect. So if you support a left-leaning party, you're 5% more likely to vote for high taxes on yourself. So this is now the rich voting to tax the rich. And if we look not at political party preference, but at this question from the survey, from an earlier wave of the survey, should the state redistribute more? It was something like this. So compared to the people who say they don't like redistribution, the people who said we want more redistribution, they also are about 6 percentage points more likely to vote for high taxes. So hypothesis 1 is supported. The left-leaning rich want to pay higher taxes than the right-leaning rich. Now migration, I'd rather show you in a picture. So we sort this setting into migration pays, that's taxes at home are high and abroad they're not, versus migration does not pay taxes in all other cases. And the black is the actual choices of the rich. We see the logic of the model works, right? If you shouldn't migrate for material reasons, only 10% do, maybe an error, maybe they just want to be nasty to the poor. If it pays, more than 60 do. The beliefs of the poor are even stronger. They expect the rich to make a bit more errors here maybe, but they expect that almost all rich people migrate if it pays. And the interesting thing is here, this difference is likely room for social preference. It pays for the rich to migrate, but often they don't. The poor actually don't expect that. Let's look at the relationship to political preferences, and we see that if migration pays, the left-leaning people are about 13% less likely to migrate than the right-leaning one. When migration doesn't pay, political attitudes don't pay. And now I don't have much time, but I have to talk about my favorite footnote. If you know something about German politics, if you look at individual parties, this difference between left-wing and right-wing party is strongest for the AfD. Now, the AfD is this funny party that changes its topic every year. They started as an anti-Euro party. In 2016, when we ran this, they were primarily an anti-immigration party. Now, they are 25% more likely than the left-wing parties to vote, to migrate if it pays. So this supporters of this anti-migration party are basically economic migrants themselves. So I like that result. You could argue that that makes sense because they run away if it pays, so they think everybody else who leaves their country does it for economic reasons. Okay. Interestingly, now migration beliefs of the poor do not relate to political ideology. So it's not that the left-wing poor think that they can tax the right-wing, they can tax the rich and they won't run away. There's no difference there. Also, now tax choices of the poor, I show you another picture rather. The tax choices of the poor react to the migration incentives of the rich, but very little. Remember, the poor should like high taxes unless it pays for the rich to run away. So the poor should choose high taxes if it doesn't pay to, if the rich are not mobile or the foreign taxes are high. Only 20% do. If it would pay for the rich to migrate, it goes down to 10%. So there's a significant decrease in high taxes if migration pays, but the majority goes to the center. Second thing that's supported but weak, the poor react to their stated beliefs. If they state the rich run away, they do so less. Okay. Now, last hypothesis I want to talk about, this is the tax choices of the poor. And we've seen here the tax choices of the rich on the left. The tax choices of the poor do not relate to political party preferences, which makes sense if the beliefs don't differ. But interestingly, if we ask this redistribution preference, the people who like redistribution are more likely to vote for high taxes. And that could be because some people are highly inequality averse, but that's not related to political party preferences. Okay, so let's summarize. Basically, comparative statics with respect to the mobility are supported. Social preferences matter, but they matter not for beliefs and hence not for the poor people. They matter primarily for the rich people. It's essentially the rich, nice people, or yeah, the left-wing rich people are nicer. It's good news for scientists who tend to be overpaid and more likely to be left than right of center. So I tell you, many of you are nice people, not everybody, but okay. Last thing, point predictions are not well supported. I've already shown you that's for the poor. You could think, well, it's a survey, it's normal people, they're all confused. Here's one piece of evidence why they're not. We compare text choices and text belief. This is what you've seen before. Text choices of the poor should be much higher in this case. Now we ask the rich, what do they think? So this is here the beliefs of the rich. The rich think that the poor will choose high taxes unless it pays for the rich to migrate when they say many will move. Similarly, the rich who, if they're selfish, should choose low taxes. They also choose the medium tax, but the poor believe that the rich will choose low taxes. So it's not that people don't understand the game. It seems to be that many of them have social preferences or don't want to appear too greedy or something like this, but they don't think the others are. Okay, very brief conclusions. Political attitudes matter in the stylized tax and migration choice in the predictable way. So nothing in our thing goes in the wrong direction. And the interesting thing is we have all these measurable demographics. So it's not that political attitudes capture age, income, gender, whatever, right? This stuff is controlled for. And it's not driven by biased expectation, it's the preferences that matter, and mostly the preferences of the rich. And last 30 seconds methodological contribution, I said earlier, we first ran a lab experiment and we found, first of all, very different choices. People were much more selfish and virtually no effect of the political attitudes. And the problem is that if you're in Germany in particular, the large chunks of people support economically moderate parties. So the interesting stuff comes from the fringes. And then if we need just thousands of people essentially, right, to get enough power on the fringes. And a bad thing also in the experiment, if you do this redistribution experiment, and then you ask people for, do they like redistribution and which party they vote for, you might get demand effects there. And it's much nicer to have that from earlier ways in the survey. So for our research question, the survey is just much better. And that's why now with that, I conclude. Thanks.
Thanks, Dirk. And we are on time. And now we have a bit more than 3 minutes for discussions and questions. So perhaps we can take 2 questions. So one who asks questions, just unmute yourself.
I think I already stopped the screen sharing, right?
Yeah. Any questions from audience?
So I have not so much a question, more just of an observation, like super interesting study, and I feel like you could have probably told us about it for an hour or so. There's just so much in there, and it made me think of, there's been some recent work by Stephanie Stancheva looking at how it's not exactly differences in factual differences, but differences in our perceptions of the state of inequality, or of what that implies, that influence our preferences for things like redistributive policies. And I just thought it connects together really nicely with that emergent literature.
Yeah, I mean, there are these issues that people estimate the redistribution. Yeah, exactly. They have very different perception of inequality, right? And that's also why this paper I mentioned, the Kajers, Müllerstrom, Simon, this is when you tell them, they just change their preferences also, right? When you tell them that where they're actually wrong. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have time for one quick question. Is there any? If not, then we welcome our third speaker, Karen. And now you can share your screen and start.
No. I can't seem to see the share screen button.
It should be a green one at the bottom in the center.
Ah, yes, it is there. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, can everybody see?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just start my timer to keep me on track. There we go. All right, so yeah, my name is Karen Jeffrey, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. And I'm really happy to have the chance to share this research that I've been working on with you today. I conduct a survey experiment where I test how informing individuals that they might be vulnerable to an automation shock, so that they might lose their job or have higher job insecurity because of automation, how that influences their preferences for redistributive policies, and how exposure to specific types of rhetoric mediate the response in their preferences. So before I get started, just very quickly to say what I mean when I'm talking about automation is the use of a robot or software or an algorithm to carry out any task that would previously have been performed by a human worker. And the motivation for this research comes from a growing body of literature that we've seen emerging in the past few decades that suggests that as more work is automated, we're not really seeing much of an impact in terms of unemployment levels going up. But what we have seen is that as more jobs are or more work proves to be capable of being automated, we're seeing growth in inequality between different types of workers, as well as growth in inequality between workers and technology owners. And this has prompted a number of high-profile policymakers and politicians to come out and advocate for some quite radical redistributive policies that are designed to decouple growth and automation from growth and inequality. So policies like provision of a universal basic income, or like allowing workers to reduce their working hours by 20% with no reduction in pay, or things like a robot tax. The question that I am interested in is, as workers are increasingly being exposed to automation, are they likely to get behind these types of quite radical redistributive policies? So the theoretical underpinning for this work starts off thinking about the canonical models of preference formation that have assumed that voters will support redistribution as long as it's in their economic interest to do so. But of course, what we've seen in the past 2 or 3 decades is that a very large body of literature showing that preferences for redistribution depend on quite a bit more than just rational self-interest, whether that's because voters are not as well informed about what different policies might mean for their self-interest as those earlier models had assumed, or because other factors are influencing their preferences for redistribution. And one of the factors that's been identified as being very influential is rhetoric, or the persuasive communication that individuals are exposed to. And I think today, more than ever before, this is really important, because with social media, just about anyone can have a platform where they reach a lot of people with their narratives or rhetoric, persuasive communication. And so it's really important that we understand how that is influencing people's policy preferences. So within that strand of literature, there have been a couple of studies that seem to suggest there's an interesting interaction between individuals who are exposed to labour market shock and who are exposed to politicised rhetoric, such that if the rhetoric speaks to the concerns of those individuals who are facing a labour market shock, it can be particularly effective at influencing their preferences, and can cause them to update their preferences in a way that's misaligned with their economic interests. And so the theory behind my study is that existing rhetoric could resonate with individuals who are facing an automation shock to suppress support for redistributive policies. And I think there are a couple of really prevalent narratives, especially in the UK media, but elsewhere as well, that might cause that to happen. So the first is stigmatization of welfare claimants, as well as the idea that taxing wealth creators would threaten jobs. And so if you're facing job insecurity yourself, I think these two narratives might be particularly resonant for you, and could cause you to influence your policy preferences. So from that, I hypothesize first that informing individuals about their potential vulnerability to an automation shock could suppress or decrease their preferences for redistributive policies. And of course, that is contradicting what those canonical models had assumed. But this more recent literature seems to suggest that may be plausible. And second, that kind of like fighting fire with fire, so exposing individuals to politicized rhetoric that's designed to challenge some of those existing narratives that could be suppressing support for redistributive policies, will increase preferences for redistributive policies. So I pre-specified both of those hypotheses in a pre-analysis plan. And in the plan, I also included that I would do some further analysis looking for a heterogeneous response in preferences across different education levels. And I think this, in the context of automation, is a really interesting question to look into, because so many of the workers, or the majority of the workers who've been exposed to an automation shock to date, have been less educated workers. But as we see technologies becoming more and more advanced and capable of doing more and more complex tasks, we're starting to see more educated workers finding that elements of their occupations can be automated. So things like junior legal professionals and some medical specialists. And there have been a few studies predicting that going forward, as technologies become even more sophisticated, we'll see more educated individuals increasingly being affected. So I wanted to try and understand whether those more educated and less educated individuals might respond differently to the treatments. And just very briefly to situate this within the existing literature. So there have been a few studies in this area. It's a really new topic, but one that's getting a lot of interest. So it's growing quite rapidly, the literature on this, but several studies have found that exposure to automation to date is associated with voters becoming more supportive of far-right parties. And then quite a different finding, a couple of studies have found that exposure is associated with more support for redistribution in quite general terms. So these studies are all observational, but there have also been a couple of experimental studies which have found that if you make people feel more concerned about their exposure to automation, it has no effect on their preferences for redistributive policies. So my contribution to this literature is, I'm contributing experimental results where many of the studies have been observational. I'm also testing I test preferences for 7 specific policies. So a lot of the studies so far have looked at the effect in terms of voting behavior or in terms of support for, like, would you agree that it's the responsibility of governments to reduce the gap between rich and poor? So redistribution in quite general terms, but I get some quite interesting findings looking at the different policies. And then, of course, the existing experimental studies, I add a little bit to what they have done by looking at how rhetoric influences the preferences, as well as informing respondents that they might be vulnerable to a shock. Okay, so onto the research design. I worked with a survey company called Prolific to reach a sample of 2,500 adults resident in the UK. The survey took about 4 minutes to complete on average, and I used block randomization to make sure that I had a balance across the treatment groups in terms of their demographic composition. I also used post-stratification weights to ensure that the overall sample matched the demographic breakdown of the UK population as closely as possible. And the survey contained 4 key elements. So respondents were first asked some socio-demographic questions. They were then randomly assigned to one of 3 treatment groups before being asked about their policy preferences, and then some questions about their expectations and beliefs that I used to try and understand the mechanisms behind any treatment effect. So the first treatment group received the automation shock treatment. And in this treatment, respondents were told 1 in 3 jobs in the UK are expected to be lost to automation in the next 10 to 15 years. And this could lead to lower wages, it could lead to higher unemployment. And an important feature of the treatment was that it emphasized that highly educated workers are also at risk. So this was to try and let me understand any heterogeneity in the way that more and less educated workers responded. So to do that, it said exactly this, and it also talked about, you know, so far we have seen some supermarket checkout staff being affected, but we're also seeing some legal professionals and some medical specialists are starting to be affected. And then the treatment ended with quite a neutral statement saying political parties need to do something, but it's not clear what. And then the automation shock with rhetoric treatment. It begins the same way as the automation shock treatment. So talking about the potential risk in terms of employment and, oh, sorry, I don't know if you can see, I'm getting alerts here. And stressing that highly educated workers are also at risk. But then in place of that neutral statement saying political parties need to do something, I introduced this intentionally loaded rhetoric which says billionaire bosses and shareholders will profit while ordinary workers lose their jobs. And so this was designed to appeal to respondents' fairness considerations and also to challenge that idea that I think the prevalent rhetoric might be promoting, that taxing wealth creators threatens jobs, and that might be something that suppresses support for redistributive policies. And then it goes on to say, if we find a way to share the wealth that's created, we could all work less and spend more time doing the things we enjoy. So here the intention is to present a positive vision of the welfare system, and to try and challenge this or distract attention away from stigmatization of welfare claimants that we see quite a lot in the media. And then the final group received a placebo treatment, which was a similar format and style to the other two treatments, but designed to have a neutral effect on the policy preferences under consideration. So onto the results. And before I look at the effect of the treatments on policy preferences, I first wanted to be sure that the treatments had achieved what they were intended to do, which was first and foremost to make respondents feel more concerned that they might be vulnerable to an automation shock. And what you can see here is both the automation shock and the automation shock with rhetoric treatment increased agreement relative to the baseline, with the statement, it's likely that you or a member of your family will lose your job to automation within the next 10 to 15 years. And so that increased by between just over 5 and around 11 percentage points relative to the baseline. So that was good. The treatments achieved what I'd hoped that they would do, which was to make people feel more concerned that they might be affected by an automation shock. And now looking at the effect of the treatments on respondents' policy preferences. So you can see there are I tested 7 different redistributive policies, and the pink markers here are showing the effect of the automation shock treatment on preferences. So what you see is for the top 2 rows there, despite making people feel more concerned that they might be negatively affected by an automation shock, the preferences for those first 2 redistributive policies actually significantly declined relative to the baseline. And then preferences for the remaining redistributive policies, there was no significant effect of the treatment, with the exception of, in the bottom row there, the policy of reducing working time without reducing pay, which we see a fairly large, about 6 or 7 percentage points, significant increase in support for it. And I think that was quite an interesting anomaly. I suspect the reason that was the only policy to see any increase in preferences for may be because respondents perceive that policy as potentially offering protection against job loss. And that's something that's unique compared to all of the other policies. Unfortunately, I haven't tested that specifically, but I suspect that may be what's going on there. And then if we look at the effect of adding in the rhetoric, so the automation shock with rhetoric treatment, what we see is for the first 2 policies, the addition of rhetoric prevents that decline in support. And then for all of the other policies, with the exception of providing a universal basic income, the addition of rhetoric increases support significantly for those policies. So just to sum up what this is showing, it seems to be that as individuals feel more concerned that they might be vulnerable to an automation shock, their preferences for some redistributive policies either decline or remain constant, with the exception of the reducing working time policy. But then adding in that rhetoric that's designed to challenge potential sources of resistance to redistribution either prevents any decline or increases support for those redistributive policies. So I wanted to try and understand why the automation shock appeared to be able to do that. And what was going on there. So I tested the theorized mechanisms that I thought might, why the treatment might work or might influence people. And what I found was that so this is looking at the marginal effect of the automation shock with rhetoric treatment relative to the automation shock treatment. So it's the marginal effect of adding in the rhetoric to the treatment. And what I found was the rhetoric had basically no effect on people's agreement that increasing corporation tax leads to job losses, or on the statement benefits are too high and discourage people from working, which I used to try and capture negative perceptions of welfare recipients. But what it did do was to significantly increase agreement with the statement, it would be unfair if automation increased inequality. So I take that to suggest that one of the ways that the treatment influenced people was by making them feel more concerned about inequality. And I think that aligns quite nicely with some of the existing studies. So the ALMAS study that Dirk mentioned in his presentation as well. So yeah, and then just finally, I looked at heterogeneous effects by education level. So what I did here was I used principal component analysis to aggregate the treatment effects for the 7 redistributive policies into a support for redistributive policies index. And I looked at the effects by 4 different education levels. And what you see is that so in the pink, the automation shock treatment, it caused preference or support for redistributive policies to increase more for the least and most educated respondents, whereas for the middle 2 education categories, it either had no real effect or produced a small decline in preferences. However, when I introduced that rhetoric, I thought it was really interesting. The most and least educated respondents, the rhetoric basically had no effect on them whatsoever. Whereas for those middle 2 education categories, the addition of rhetoric increased their support for redistributive policies significantly. And I thought it was quite interesting. I know that they're not significant on their own, but that coefficient for individuals educated to bachelor's degree level switched from being negative in response to the automation shock treatment to being positive in response to the addition of the rhetoric. So just to sum up, I find that as individuals feel more vulnerable to an automation shock, their preferences for redistributive policies either remain constant or decline, with the exception of the reducing working time policy. And rhetoric that appeals to respondents' sense of fairness seems to be an important mechanism in terms of increasing preferences for several of the redistributive policies. So for me, this really underscores the crucial role played by rhetoric in shaping preferences. One of the other experimental studies that I mentioned in the beginning finds no effect of making people feel more concerned about an automation shock, and concludes that the threat of automation does not change policy preferences. But what I think the results of this study show is that it is really useful to take a wider perspective on that and consider the ways that other factors may be coming into play to influence that. So not only looking at labour market effects, but also thinking about other factors such as rhetoric. I find that the effects are particularly pronounced amongst respondents who have a bachelor's degree, which suggests to me that going forward, if more educated workers are increasingly affected, then one thing that we might see is more resistance to redistributive policies. However, that group was also particularly responsive to the rhetoric, so that also suggests maybe rhetoric will become increasingly influential over policy preferences. And then finally, something that this study contributes is policy level analysis, which reveals some interesting variation. And particularly, I think it was quite interesting that individuals seem to favor that job protecting policy, so the reducing working time policy, over other policies that are designed to enhance the social safety net. And that's everything from me, so thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Perfectly on time. So is there any questions for audience? We have 5 minutes for discussion. Any questions?
So I may have one. So when you say they become less supportive of redistribution, a lot. I mean, they're supposed to benefit more from it, right? Why do they think, without rhetoric, that they like it less? Because is this fear that this is economically another burden and things will even go worse, or what exactly do you think is happening?
Yeah, sure. It's a super great question and kind of puzzling, and it wasn't entirely intuitive to me when I was first like putting the theory together for this survey. And but I suspect it may be something like, as respondents or as individuals feel more nervous about an automation shock, having this like, we need to sort of batten down the hatches, make everything more safe, like we can't afford to be paying out benefits. Also thinking about, you know, if for other people as well as myself, and just like this, it seems to me quite emotional as opposed to a rational response. Like sort of this feeling of fear causes people to sort of batten down the hatches. Another idea could be this element of like people preferring job protecting policies as opposed to increasing the social safety net, which I think is something that we, when I saw that result, it made a lot of sense to me intuitively, especially if people don't want to, you know, if it is correct that there's this stigmatization of claiming welfare. I was just reading an interview the other day where it said, somebody said, you know, I'd rather starve than go on the dole because it's so shameful. So I thought that was also another interesting angle to it.
Yeah, but why that strength? I mean, there are reasons not to want this redistributive one, but if there are more threats, I mean, yeah, I don't know. If there's an explicit trade-off between policies, it's easy to understand why you just want less redistribution. It's maybe also this idea, well, if more people lose their jobs, it's going to be costlier. So if I still have one, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're screwed either way. Either
Yeah.
you lose your job or you have to pay for the others who do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is that could be another important aspect of it. And you see it as well in the other studies that find the increase in anti-immigrant sentiment. The way that they explain it is, yeah, people have this fear, although I suppose that's actually slightly different to what you were saying. But it's like they promise to protect you against insecurity by saying, you know, we're going to limit the number of people who receive help from the state and the number of people who will, you know, want to draw on that limited pool of welfare that's available. Thanks.
Okay, Karen, I have a question. It's basically out of curiosity. I wonder if in your survey you can you have demographic data about people. I mean, I don't know if you can distinguish whether people, some respondents may already experience this shock before, like they got unemployed because their job was actually removed because of the industry progress, versus those who didn't experience. I don't know if you can tell these people apart, and if these people give different responses for your treatments.
Yeah, really good question. And I don't have that exact data, but what I can show you, if I just very briefly, I'll share my screen again. I am here. This is the, oh, it's quite small. But this is the breakdown of those who agreed or disagreed that they might lose their job to automation. And what you can see is that is pretty stable. I think it's lower for older people because they're not worried about losing their job because they're closer to retirement. And then there's a little bit of variation here, which, I mean, this would kind of fit with your theory slightly. You know, less educated have tended to be more likely to be negatively affected. And here again, but I do some regressions on that in the paper, and it's not significantly explaining the result that I'm finding, which is kind of unexpected.
I see, thanks, that's clear. Yeah, okay, so I'm the last speaker. I can now share my screen. Yeah, I can also set a timer for myself. But if I'm over time, please just let me know.
I will let you know, don't worry.
Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. And today I'm going to talk about a project entitled Media Bias and Elections, an Experimental Study. And this is a joint work with my co-authors Arthur Schromm and Randolph Sloove. Both of them are from the University of Amsterdam. So the motivation of this project is
could you make it full screen? Because it's kind of
okay.
smaller. So if you could make it full screen, it would be better too.
Sorry, I didn't notice that. Yeah, okay. So the motivation of this paper is very simple. Basically, all over the world, in all elections, voters need information to assess the candidates. And the most common information source they acquire from the mass media. But we also know that media bias is very pervasive and it can arise from many different sources. There is already ample empirical evidence on that. So it is a big concern for how media bias could influence voting behavior and the election outcomes. And this concern has spiked, especially after the Trump's victory in the 2016 US presidential elections. In this paper, we look at this question. Of course, we are not the only one to look at this question. This is already started extensively in the literature. The most existing studies focus on empirically documenting media's electoral influence using observational data or field experiments. In this study, we do it differently by developing a theory to understand the media's influence, and then we design a lab experiment to test it. So the research questions we look at are twofold. The first is, how do biased media affect election outcomes and the voter turnout? This will be the primary part of my talk today. And the second question is, can biased media distort voters' perceptions about candidates? In other words, if the media becomes more biased towards one candidate, can it successfully persuade the voters to view that candidate systematically better? I don't have time to talk about this question in this talk due to time limit, but the short answer we find is no. Actually, at least in our experiments, media bias does not really systematically distort voters' beliefs. Okay, so as I just mentioned, we developed both a theory and an experiment on media bias and elections. Now let me briefly introduce the theory. So the core of theory is as follows. News released by media allows voters to infer two pieces of information. The first is the relative quality of candidates. This determines their candidate choice. And the second is the competitiveness of the election. This determines their aggregate voter turnout. And let me illustrate these mechanisms through a thought experiment. I've called it a thought experiment because it didn't happen in reality, but I think it's very good to illustrate the mechanism. So a thought experiment is, imagine what would happen if Fox News had endorsed Hillary Clinton in the 2016 US presidential election. Given that Fox News has a widely perceived strong bias towards the Republican, its endorsement for Clinton must imply that Clinton has a much superior real quality than Trump. And therefore, it will be able to convince most of the voters to vote for Clinton. So Clinton would win by a significant margin. But this in turn implies that the election will not be competitive at all. For this reason, voter turnout will be low because the election will not be close anyway, and the voting is very unlikely to change the election outcome. So for this reason, voters have little incentive to vote. So the basic idea is to understand how media affect the election outcome, look at what it implies about the qualities of candidates. And to understand how media affect voter turnout, look at its impact on the implications for the expected competitiveness of the elections. Using this idea behind, we develop a theory that can accommodate many existing empirical findings in a unified way. We do this in another theory paper. And for this paper I'm presenting, we are designing an experiment to test our theory proposed here. Yeah, and let me say a few words about why we think that experiment is a good complement to existing field studies. The most important things, I think, are twofold. The first is that in the lab experiment, we can use strategy methods. And in this way, we can observe outcomes under all possible information sets, both what happens and counterfactual. For instance, we can observe what happens when Fox News endorsed Hillary Clinton or it endorsed Trump. Well, in reality, with the field data, you can only see one of the two outcomes. You cannot see both. And another special advantage, I think, is that our lab experiment allows us to provide direct evidence for how media affect the final election outcome. Well, this is hard to observe in the field, because in the field you can only observe the behavior of a small fraction of voters. You cannot do treatment interventions for the whole electorate. And other advantages are standard benefits from better control of experiments. And due to limited time in the talk, I'm not going to talk. I'm going to skip the related literature. So let me talk about the experimental design setup we have. So we consider an election between two candidates under simple majority rule. These candidates are framed as two vases, vase A and vase B. And the candidates differs in their quality, which we frame as diamonds. And it is induced in this way. So at the beginning of the election, the computer randomly selects a vase and fills in it with K diamonds. The number of diamonds filled in is randomly chosen from integers of 10, basically 10, 20, 30, all the way to 100. And each voter will get a payoff that equals to the number of diamonds contained in, if the vase containing a diamond is elected. Because this bonus is given to all voters. In that case, the quality of candidates are commonly valued. And there are 25 voters. Each voter also has their ideological preference, which we induced by team assignment and a private bonus. Basically, each voter is randomly assigned to either team A or to team B. And they will get a private bonus equals to V if the elected vase matches their team identity. And this private bonus is randomly chosen from three numbers, 20, 50, or 100. This measures the strength of their ideological preference. It can either be a low, moderate, or very extreme. So in this way, voters cares not only about candidates' qualities, but also about their own ideological preference. And finally, we assume that voting is voluntary but costly. If you vote, you incur a cost. And this cost is randomly drawn from integers from 1 to 15. And this is the electorate. And we assume that voters cannot directly observe the diamond allocations in vases. They have to rely on media for that information. The media outlets in our experiments, we frame them as robots. They can only report two messages, which is A or B, using a cutoff strategy that I will define later. When we have treatments with one media and also with two media, but for this talk, we focus on one media case. There we distinguish between four conditions. The first is a control condition where voters get no information. They don't know the diamond allocations in the two vases. In the other three, there will be one media providing information, and the media can be either biased, weakly biased towards candidate A, or strongly biased towards candidate B. And let me briefly explain how the media send their messages. So this table summarizes the media's reporting strategy. The first two columns of this table summarizes all the possible diamond allocations in different vases. So there are 20 possible configurations. Each of them are equally likely. Robot alpha is an unbiased media in the sense that it sends message A only if A contains diamonds, and sends message B only if B contains diamonds. So it endorses the candidate that contains diamonds and thus have a superior quality. Robot beta is weakly biased towards candidate A in the sense that it may send message A even if B has a superior quality and B contains some diamonds. But the bias is limited in the sense that if the diamonds in B, if the number of diamonds in D is very high, then it will switch to endorse B instead. Finally, robot gamma represents a very strongly biased media in the sense that it almost always endorses candidate A, except when all the diamonds goes to base B. So you can see that as media bias increases, there are three effects. First, the more biased media is going to send message A more frequently from the exante perspective. But at the same time, message A becomes less credible in signaling the quality of base A. And conversely, message B becomes more credible in signaling the superiority of base B. So that's how we define media bias in our paper. Yeah, and there's a few other details about how we do the experiments, but I'm not going to cover all of them due to the time limits. But one thing to note is that we use strategy method to elicit voters' decisions. So we ask them what would they do if they see message A, or what would they do if they see message B. So in this case, we can see their behavior conditional on all possible media endorsement. Okay, here's some other details. Let me skip it. And now let me see. Now let me show you the predictions and results. We derive the perfect Bayes and Nash equilibrium of the above game I presented, and we do the comparative statics for what happens when we increase the bias of this media. And we first look at the impact of media on the election outcome. The theoretical predictions are depicted in this picture. So the horizontal axis is the four treatment conditions, 3 with a media bias, with a media with different bias, and the final one is a control with no information. And the vertical axis is the candidate A's winning probability. The red line is A's winning probability conditional on message A, and you can see that it decreases in media bias. This is intuitive because as media becomes more biased, its endorsement for A is less credible and less likely to convince voters to vote for A, so A's winning probability decrease. And conversely, when message B is sent, the A's winning probability remains very low throughout the way, because message B becomes more and more incredible in signaling the superiority of B when media increasingly biased towards A. So message B becomes more effective. And the black line is the outcome from the exante perspective. This is basically the weighted average of the outcome conditional on message A and conditional on message B, weighted by the prior likelihood of sending message A. We can see now that the relationship is non-monotonic. When the media is unbiased, both endorsements are very credible, so it's effective in push people to vote for the endorsed candidates, and in the endorsed candidates wins with high probability. But exante, it endorses both candidates with equal probability. So from the exante perspective, it will not push the election outcome systematically in favor of either candidate. And at the other extreme, when the media is extremely biased towards A, then it almost always sends message A. But this message A becomes almost uninformative and gradually fails to influence voters' behavior. So we can see that conditional message A voters' behavior are actually quite close to what would happen without any information when voters are uninformed. This is because this message is close to uninformative, and the voters will almost ignore it in making their decisions. And for this reason, the election outcome from the exante perspective also goes back to 50, because this strongly biased media is not capable of persuading the voters. Only when the media is weakly biased, it can have a systematic impact on the election outcomes. That's why we observe this non-monotonic prediction. The solid lines shows the data, and the data we find is that, a rough look at data shows that when the media is unbiased or weakly biased, it goes very well in line with the theoretical predictions. The only systematic deviation happens when the media is strongly biased and message A is sent. Here, the observed A's winning probability is way higher than predicted. And as a consequence, this overruled our non-monotonicity prediction and making that from the exemptive perspective, A's winning probability monotonically increases in media bias. So it is as if that the strongly biased media systematically persuaded. So it's as if voters are systematically fooled by this strongly biased media. And the strongly biased media successfully pushed the election outcome systematically in its own favor. And you might want to know why we observe this. Is this because voters are simply naive and credulous and believe whatever the media says, even if the endorsement is very uncredible? We show that the story is not that easy, but there are some interesting patterns there. So to investigate why the election outcome, A's winning probability monotonically increases in bias, we look at how voters with different ideological preferences respond to information. And we compare only two cases, the case where there is no information and the case when the strongly biased media send message A. These are presented in these figures. So the figures in the top presented the relative vote share, blue bars, and the voter turnout among voters among supporters in Team B with different ideological strengths. And the bottom line, the bottom three panels is the same picture, but for voters in Team A, basically who support candidate A exempting. The overarching finding here is that if we compare their behavior under strongly biased media sending message A and to the no information control condition, what we find is that voters in Team A, their behavior changes very little in these two conditions. So this shows that this very strongly biased endorsement do not have much impact on their behavior. But this is not true for voters in Team B. Basically, those voters that support the opposite candidate. There we find that their turnout rate is substantially lower after receiving this strongly biased endorsement compared to the case where they have no information at all. This holds true for all the three for voters, all types of voters in Team B who has different ideologies. So in other words, a very strongly biased endorsement does not have much impact on voters who support the endorsed candidate, but it successfully dissuades voters from the other voters support the other candidates to turn out less. And also, if you look at the vote share, it also slightly persuades them to vote for the endorsed candidate a bit more. And this asymmetric response is the reason that drives the failure of our non-monotonicity results. And interestingly, this effect is contrary to to the common belief of confirmation bias, namely that one may think that an endorsement should only be effective in persuading its voters with a similar ideological preference, but people from the other side will largely ignore this endorsement. But we've shown that this is exactly the opposite in our case. So this is the reason why we don't observe why we don't confirm the non-monotonicity hypothesis. And due to the time constraints, I will stop here.
There is only a few minutes left. So
yeah. So we also did analyze the impact of media bias on turnout, but due to the limited time constraint, I will skip these details. But the overarching line is that media bias, voter turnout is systematically higher than we predicted, and it is largely invariant with media bias, as our theoretical predictions would say. We investigated this reason, and the most primary reason for this is what we call competition neglect, in the sense that voters do not really understand the implication of message of media endorsement for the elections. This can be explained using the Fox News thought experiment I mentioned in the very beginning. So endorsement for Clinton by Fox News implies that Clinton is much better than Trump, and the election should be landslide and not competitive at all. But voters in reality, they fail to understand this, and they mistakenly believe that the elections will be equally competitive regardless of media endorsement. So they fail to get how the closeness of the elections will vary with the information sent by media. And this is the primary reason that drives turnout results. So in conclusion, we provide the first experimental evidence for the impact of media bias on voting behavior and the election outcomes. We predict that an increase in media bias should affect election outcome non-monotonically and increases voter turnout. But the results show that the media bias have a systematic impact, have a monotonic impact on election outcomes, and it has little impact on voter turnout. And the reason behind is the heterogeneous response of voters from different ideologies to information, and the competition neglect I just briefly explained. So yeah, that's all my presentation, and thank you. Any questions?
there are a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. So usually in reality, it seems that the media coverage is endogenous, right? So the media does not only, influence how people see the candidates and how close the election is, also the other way around, right? So the closeness of the election and the quality of the candidates will influence how active the media is, right? So the experiment doesn't capture these kind of equilibrium effects.
Yeah, precisely. And it is indeed true that, for instance, an election would receive more media coverage if it is a close race, because close race is more interesting, and that could well be the case. And for our experiment purpose, we don't capture this, and we just want to focus on isolating the direct effect of media bias. Yeah,
I'm just wondering if there could be kind of like self-confirming effects, right? So that is kind
definitely
of a cycle which is started, and that makes the election either very close or very boring or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And these confounding reasons are also a reason why we want to seek some experimental controls to isolate this. But I agree. Definitely more works should be done and should think about to connect the experimental funding to the real world. That's definitely true. Yeah. Any other questions?
So I was originally also just wondering about, so you, there is some recent papers that look into the consumption of media and information, and what they find is that basically people are biased in the way they look for information in the first place, right? So and how does that relate to your research? Because what he was saying is that people go to Fox News exactly because he endorses Trump, right? So it is not that you discover that all of a sudden he endorses Hillary Clinton. You choose this, your time of the choice. It's kind of happens even before what you describe. So I was just kind of I was thinking about this, I don't know, misalignment with this recent pieces of research, right? So how do you put yourself in comparison to that?
Yeah, so in this paper, what I'm focusing on is I basically view media as a public information source, basically in the sense that its information can get to the whole public. In reality, of course, there are some segregation in media consumption. Media consumption can be endogenous, but there are two. So I mean, this is an important difference, and I agree that this is not the setting we look at. But I still think that the setting we study is relevant in the sense that for most mass public news, they reach a wide set of audience, and you may accept that. So in a sense, all the mass media has a substantial base of our audience, and even the audience of Fox News and say New York Times, they may have a substantial overlap. So I mean, endogenous consumption of media is one point, but I mean on the other, but it's still.
I mean, it would be very easy to adjust your experiment a little bit and have parties and voters, right? So you kind of could
we have. So basically, well, the voters with like private bonus of 100, they are partisan in the sense that they prefer one candidate over the other, regardless of information. Right. But they consume media, and they consume media for a reason. I mean, they consume media to not actually to expect the media to tell them which candidate to vote for, but they consume the media in order to learn whether the election will be close and to decide whether they should turn out or not. So in this sense, I would say all voters, regardless whether you are partisan or not, you have a reason to consume media. And in our case, and in this paper, we specifically focus on the case where we treat media as a public communicator, descending information that have the reach to the general public. And yeah, for the selective media consumption issue, I mean, this is a very natural extension of this paper. And actually, I'm working on it in a separate in a paper, try to say basically how how voting motives affect voters' media consumption decisions.